I'm Bernice Slutzman, and I would like to welcome you all to the new Krakow Friendship Society's commemoration of the 79th anniversary of the liquidation of the Krakow Ghetto. The timing of today's observance is perfect, as it was in this month and on this date that the liquidation took place 79 years ago. It was a week before the festival of Purim, as it is today. Yesterday, the Torah portion was Zachor, remember. Our ancestors were commanded to remember the deeds of Amalek. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way when you were leaving Egypt, that he happened upon you on the way, and he struck those of you who were hindmost, all the weaklings at your rear, when you were faint and exhausted. And he did not fear God, and it shall be that when Hashem, your God, gives you as an inheritance to possess it, you shall wipe out the memory of Amalek from under the heaven. You shall not forget. And that's in Deuteronomy 25:17-19. Why do we read that passage on Shabbat Zachor? Haman is said to be a descendant of Amalek, since the connection and the reason for remembering the incident just described. I bring this very brief lesson of Jewish tradition to you today, because although it is not Amalek we remember today, we follow the commandment to remember the evil that was done to our people, not in ancient times, but in the vast scope of our people's history, only yesterday. We're here today who are not old enough to remember firsthand any of the events which took place on Platz Godi, but we are the repositories of the memories of our parents and grandparents. We remember their memories as imparted to us. Today, you will hear from several speakers, hear renditions of poignant melodies and prayers, and pause for a moment of silence as we witness the lighting of 6 candles representing the 6 million murdered in the Shoah. They will be lit by intergenerational members. One of the candle lighters is 100-and-a-half-year-old Regina Lewis. Ani Ma'amin, which you will hear, was voiced by those who knew they were about to die. It speaks of how they still believed in the coming of the Messiah, even though his arrival may be delayed. They still believed. The partisan hymn, the anthem of those young heroes who valiantly fought against the Nazis in the ghetto, will be sung near the close of our program. Kaddish will be recited, and we will end the program with the singing of Hatikvah. I thank you all for joining us as we proceed now.
Ani ma'amim, ani ma'amim, ani ma'amim, ani ma'amim, be'emunah shlema, b'viat HaMashiach, b'viat HaMashiach ani ma'amim, ve'af al pi she'yitmamea, im kol ze ani ma'amim. Ani ma'amim, ani ma'amim, ani ma'amim, ani ma'amim, be'emunah shlema, b'viat HaMashiach. המשיח, בביאת המשיח אני מאמין, ואף על פי שיתממע, עם כל זה אני מאמין.
Thank you, Cantor. That was beautiful. When NCFS asked me to talk about my parents, Arthur and Irene Gross, both from Krakow and Holocaust survivors, I hesitated. What words can I use, memories I can share that would honor them and contribute to combating hate and anti-Semitism? I'm not a historian, a poet, or philosopher, but I do know that speaking from the heart, from a place of truth, and speaking simply can be powerful. I learned this from my mother, and it is what inspired me to work with Anna Gallegos to create the NCFS Power of Our Stories series, a program we started 2 years ago as part of our mission to work in communities teaching tolerance. The Holocaust helps us examine very current issues affecting us around the world, such as the power of extremist ideologies, propaganda, and group-targeted hate and violence. Data from the Holocaust can be daunting, yet when we hear an authentic, personal story, it allows us to make the human connection. It makes it meaningful and sometimes inspires us to take action. I decided that because I only have a few minutes to the mother, Irka, maybe as a thank you to her for the magnificent gifts she gave me and my sister, compassion, kindness, and resilience, a guidebook on how to live life fully. I may not follow it always, but it's wonderful to be in possession of the North Star for living. She would have been 100 last week. Thank you, Mommy. I selected a few photographs, which I will bring up right now. A few precious few from before the war, afterwards when they came to New York City, and more recent showing our family and our newest member of our family, Fox Offit, my grandnephew. My mother's maiden name was Weimer. She was born in 1922 and raised in Krakow. She had an older sister who died before she was born. Her father, my grandfather, was an officer in the Polish army. As my mother described him, he was tall, very handsome, and charismatic. She told me he looked just like Gregory Peck. He died before the war. So it was my mother and my grandmother that stayed together in the ghetto for as long as they could. Whoops, I'm going backwards here. For as long as they could, until my grandmother was murdered by an SS officer. My parents met at a summer resort outside of Krakow. My mother was 11, my father was 14. My mother had a very big crush on my father. He was older and didn't much notice her at first. Eventually he came around and they were married in the ghetto under the stars, as my mother said. My mother was 18 and my father was 21. Early on, they were in the same camps, but over time they were separated and didn't know if either was alive. They found each other in Germany, stayed in a DP camp in Munich until my father finished school. He studied architecture. They came to America, New York City in 1947 and had 2 daughters, my older sister and myself, Rita. My mother eventually too went back to school. She got her bachelor's degree and became a recreational therapist. She spent many years at Sloan Kettering working with cancer patients, helping them through difficult times, focusing on kindness, resilience, and compassion. An important note, my parents had a unique bond. They knew each other's families before the war, before the camps, before the ghetto. So they had an opportunity to share their history together. They knew each other's grandparents, parents, and Benno, my father's younger brother, who also was murdered in the camps. This connection was a blessing, and I believe helped them move on and thrive. I learned about the Holocaust and knew that my parents were survivors when I was very young, around 5 years old. I learned later that there was a lot of debate in the house and with cousins and survivor friends about whether or not to talk about the Holocaust with the children. But my mother was adamant. Her girls needed to know. It was their story too. She didn't want us to learn about it in school, outside the home, or maybe the world would try and bury what happened. So she started the sharing process by telling gentle stories about life in the ghetto and then the camps, usually on our walks to the bank, grocery store, bakery, and at bedtime. Her stories were sweet yet powerful. How she traded a potato for lipstick so she can look good when my father came to visit her. How she and others hid a young boy in the barracks until they can get him out safely. How they had secret spots near the barracks where people can come together to share their feelings and provide updates on friends and family. She told me the wedding band that she had on her finger was her original wedding band, and that she hid that ring inside her throughout the war. She told me how she admired the beauty of the Hungarian women. Even though their heads were shaved, they looked like angels. As I got older, the stories became more vivid, and she exposed me to more of her horrors, what it felt like to be in a packed cattle car, getting hit in the head by a policeman, an injury that may have contributed to her Parkinson's later in life, and how my grandmother was murdered in front of my mother. She told me that she pleaded with an SS officer to let the two of them stay together. She even showed the SS officer her father's army medal. The SS officer instead shot my grandmother on the spot. As my mother tells it, the officer had some kindness in him because he spared her mother the gas chamber, and this kept my mother alive. Mom told me later in life that she did a lot of preparation before each of these story sessions. She would make sure to leave out parts that I may have not been ready for. Her commitment was for me to feel safe and proud, and to focus on humanity that showed itself in the most horrific situations. I started to formally learn about the Holocaust in school, junior high school. The books included frightening images and overwhelming numbers, and most of my classmates could not make the connection. For them, it was ancient history. So I started to share the stories my mother told me, and some of my schoolmates had the opportunity to hear it directly from her. Mommy shared these experiences in a way that made it okay to ask questions, to learn. She would magically also translate these experiences into relatable situations and give important life lessons. She'd often say, please do all you can not to judge others. You never know what choices you would make if you were under huge stress. For example, you might give your seat to a stranger on the subway if you were feeling happy and strong. But would you make the same decision if you were feeling hungry, tired, in physical or emotional pain? She made you think. She also told us about the power of kindness. She acknowledged that it takes strength to be kind, but she said it also gave her strength. It's the spinach for the soul, she would say, and it is how I survived and why she survived. The kind acts of others and the strength she receives from being kind. It was just an incredible way to be, and I thank you again, Mommy. One more memory I feel compelled to share. My mother loved popcorn. She told me that when she was in the camps, She would dream that one day there would be a movie about her experience. She imagined she would eat popcorn as she watched the movie. Many, many years later, my husband and I took my parents to see Schindler's List. My mother insisted on popcorn. I sat next to her. We watched the film. She held me close and she ate the popcorn. She encouraged me to partake. And in that moment, I experienced her three gifts: kindness, compassion, and resilience. I miss you, Mommy, and I pray that you and Daddy are together and at peace. Thank you.
My name is Maria Helfman. I'm on the board of directors for the new Krakow Friendship Society. I was born in Krakow, and both my parents, Samuel and Janet Stoger, were Holocaust survivors. In Krakow, 1947, my father testified at the trial of Amon Get. This testimony included details about the March 13, 1943 liquidation of the Krakow Ghetto. On that day, Amon Get ordered the removal and murder of women and children. After that event, my father never saw his family, including his wife and young son, again. However, just recently, I have discovered that he also gave testimony on February 21st, 1947, in Krakow, to the main commission for the investigation of German war crimes in Poland. I'm going to read excerpts from my father's testimony. Here's the part of the testimony. During the occupation, I lost my whole family of 13 people, including my wife and child. Within that time, I was sent to the Krakow Ghetto in Plaszów, Camp Pionki, Camp Auschwitz, Gliwice, and Blechhammer. I arrived at the concentration camp in Auschwitz in a group transport from Pionki. We were unloaded in Birkenau the 29th of July, 1944. There were 2,500 people in the transport. Women and children were separated from the men who were fit to work. Old men were grouped with the women and children. When we arrived there at Birkenau, Adam Moore was the head of the camp. Food was insufficient, especially since some of our portions were stolen by the guards. So the majority of us suffered from diarrhea. And the average 300 prisoners out of 1,500 would be sick. The corpses were then transported to the crematoria at Auschwitz. The dead were replaced with new prisoners sent to the camp so that the total number of prisoners was always 1,500. With regular monthly intervals, the SS men from Auschwitz, including the SS doctor, would come to the camp and conduct selections. That is when they would select those who were unfit to work. The selected prisoners were then transported to the Auschwitz camp and gassed. They were then replaced by newly transported prisoners. Germans who supervised our work in the repair shops would then report us to the camp authorities for the most trivial offenses committed during work, such as trying to get warm or eating scraps. Based on these reports, SS men Moll would subject us to flogging. Officer Moll would personally shoot prisoners for the most trivial offenses. He once caught me boiling potatoes, which I had been given at a repair shop. He assumed that I stole them from the camp warehouse and didn't believe my explanations. He beat me up, he knocked me around, set a dog on me, and then he told me to run for freedom, Lauf auf die Freiheit, pointing to the wired electrified fence around the camp. When I refused, he threatened me with a revolver, and having no choice, I ran up to the wires and started climbing. 4 shots were fired immediately, and that was the guard from the tower. None of them hit me. At almost the exact time and a moment more, the deputy drove by, who supervised our work at the repair shops, and he knew that I was a hard-working man. He pleaded with Moll on my behalf, and he saved me from death. Such incidents were very frequent. During my stay at the camp, less than a half a year, the camp claimed about 1,500 lives due to selections and natural deaths. Within that time, almost the entire camp population was replaced. At the end of my stay in the camp, very few people from the original transport which I had arrived with were alive. The camp was closed down on January 18, 1945. On that day, the prisoners were marched. Even the sick who had to be supported by colleagues were herded through the city of Kozlay to the Camp Blechhammer. If unable to march, they were shot by the SS men. The majority of the victims died when the transport was going through the forest. The SS men threw the corpses of the people who had been shot into the ditches and the side of the road. We got to Blechhammer after 3 days of marching with no food that was given to us. Upon arrival to the Camp Blechhammer, the SS men ran away, dumped their weapons, and changed into civilian clothes, even striped prisoner uniforms, so we realized that we were close to being liberated. This was the testimony given by my father to the commission. As I conclude, this was my father's unimaginable daily nightmare until the end of the war in 1945. My dear father lived until 1995, when he died in Florida and was able to enjoy his family and his grandchildren. Thank you for listening.
Eli, Eli, Shelo yigamel le'olam, ha'chol be'hayam, rish rush של המים, ברק השמיים, תפילת האדם, החול והים, רשרוש של המים, ברק השמיים, תפילת האדם. Oh Lord my God, I pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of man, the sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of man.
Thank you, Cantor. My name is Simone Hilstein Schumann. I'm the second child of 2 survivors from Krakow, Poland. My parents, Ern and Max, personally experiences were shared with me and then verified by their documented testimonies in schools and in other places and archived documents, which I found later on. My mother, in her words, had a rather wonderful, privileged life in Kazimierz, Krakow before the war. She lived with her mother and loving grandparents and met regularly with aunts and uncles. My mother loved going to school and learning. My father lived in Podgórz with his mother, younger brother, and adopted sister in a modern apartment. By his own description, they lived a good life. Both my parents had families, an extended family in Krakow vicinity, numbering in before the war actually into the hundreds. After the untimely death of my father's father, after the ultimate death of my father's father, to help his mother run the family business, a hair salon for men and women, he transferred to a trade school and became a licensed beautician barber. Just so happened the salon, as where he lived, was the location of what would be the Krakow Ghetto. This ended up being fortunate. Once my family was forced into the ghetto with so many other souls, mother, along with her mom, lived with another family in a small apartment. Mom came to know who lived in the apartment next door. This was several families, including my father. Their apartments were rather close together. The apartments were very crowded. There was less food, more illness, forced labor, and an inability to go to school. Even though there was continuous restrictions, hardships of all sorts, Erna, my mother, age 17, married my father, age 20, in the Krakow Ghetto in fall of 42. This was an arranged marriage by both their mothers, as Dad promised he was able to take care of my mother. Dad worked doing hair for the Nazis in the Krakow Ghetto and for their wives and mistresses. He had a former worker from the salon, a friend, a Christian who lived outside the ghetto, who smuggled in food for him and others. Mom sewed uniforms, repaired clothing, mostly by hand. Mom said to make a poor stitch was punishable by beating. Worked his salon, and in at least one occasion smuggled a woman and her child in a wooden wardrobe, carried on his back to the outside of the ghetto. I met this woman many years ago. She was beyond grateful. Dad had never mentioned this to me before. At the liquidation of the ghetto, on this day, as was mentioned, my father and mother witnessed babies being held by the legs and smashed against the walls. Older children, men, women shot on the spot, as my father said, in the streets and left. Then, by sheer luck, surviving this action. I cannot say more at this time. Simple to say, they both bore witness to the brutality and murdering of many innocent people on Platz Goda, the main square outside of the ghetto. For several days after, my parents and others were part of the cleanup crew. While sorting clothes, Dad found his brother David's coat. It was a bullet wound that he found, and it was bloody. By this time, Most of my family members were sent to other camps marked for death or sent to labor camps. They had little hope that they would see their families. From the liquidation of the ghetto to January 45, they were imprisoned in Plaszow, a concentration camp outside Krakow. While in Plaszow, Dad continued to work as a barber. Mom did other labor. Dad rarely saw my mother anymore since they had been separated. I have so many stories, but I'm going to limit it to this. Dad's cousin Marcus marched to Plaszow after being in other labor camps where he had stacked large bombs for the Nazis or carried 100-pound bags of concrete. As Marcus' group marched into Plaszow, he was thrilled to see his cousin Max. As Marcus' group marched in and saw Max waving, he said, "Max looks pretty good. This is not such a bad place." However, his group that he marched in with had 2 people that escaped. As thrilling as that was, for Marcus, it was, and others, it was a horror. Marcus was pulled into a room where he knew he would be killed. Cries and wailing from the room soon died down. However, Marcus was pulled out of this room to another. Marcus heard Max calling to him. "I have privileges," my father said. "I asked the guard to get you to a safe place." This was short-lived, as Max was lied to. This news made Marcus weak. So this is where he was going to die, he thought. However, Marcus saw a latrine, a toilet. He told Max when no one was looking, he would hide there. The toilet was nothing but a wooden plank with holes cut out over a trench. He jumped into the human waste that reached up to his armpit. Marcus gagged, but remained still until Max knocked 3 times. 3 times, grabbing 3 times, as was, I'm so sorry. As he was instructed by my father, he would be safe for another day. And the last story, as I said, there are pages. In Plaszow, there was Unterseführer Jan, a little man that loved to kill. Once Dad, my father, paid someone to get him some apples. Jan found out and called Father to him. My father was a barber at the time. Jan was extremely angry, but since Dad was necessary for his work, he summoned my mother. Jan put his gloves on, slapped Mother senselessly, sent her flying to the wall. Father could do nothing. Mother stood up, was slapped again. Her face was completely swollen. Dad could do nothing to help his wife, and she also knew it. But there was a tremendous bond to their death. 7 months later, my parents and remaining souls were forced to march to Auschwitz from Plaszow, approximately 40 miles. My mother, unable to walk, said she wished to die and laid down on the snow. She could not go on. She'd rather be shot. My father happened to be walking with her, and as was Marcus, his cousin. Dad picked her up and carried her for a short period of time, but he could no longer, he was getting weak. So Marcus needed to help. He needed to help since Max saved his life. Marcus needed to repay him. Marcus carried my mom of less than 80 pounds around his neck to Auschwitz. After losing one family member after another, losing friends, and their way of life, witnessing the most horrific acts of brutality, being so hungry and so long suffering physically and emotionally cruelty. I still cannot understand how survivors, my parents and my family that survived, from hundreds of family members to a handful, how they could function at all. Survivors truly were my inspiration through my life. And as Bonnie mentioned, these stories were given to me in bits and pieces till I was able to watch their testimonies and pull things together. Thank you, Mom, Dad, Marcus, and everyone that helped my parents, for it definitely was sheer luck. Lastly, I found a picture of my mother before the war. If you can see that. This is after being nursed back to health in Bergen-Belsen when she was in a DP camp in Germany. The difference. Here is a photo of my father's father in the middle, my grandfather in the beauty salon with some of his workers. They helped to bring food to my father and his family. And lastly, for normalcy, this is my father and his father and younger brother, David, during a trip to the country during the summer. My father must have been about 6 at the time. I thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. The walls of the ghettos, many of them. This is a photo of the walls built by the inmates to house the individuals in the ghetto. May they rest in peace. Thank you for hearing me out.
Thank you very much, Simone. I would like to remind all at this point, if you have not already done so, to please mute yourselves during the moment of silence. We ask those who can to please stand during the recitation of the El Male and later the recitation of Kaddish and the anthems of the Partisanes and Hatikvah. Thank you.
El Male Rachamim, Shochen Bamromim, Hametze Minucha Nechona, Tachech Anfei Hashchina, Ma'alot Kedoshim Tohorim, Kezohar Hakiyam Asirim, Lenishmo Kol Achenu B'nei Yisrael, Shenitbechu b'Shoah, Anashim Nashim V'Taf, Shenechneku v'Shenisrafu v'Shenechregu, Shemasru et nafsham al Kiddush Hashem, Began Eden Dehi Menuchatam, Ana Ba'al Harachamim, Astirei besetech nefech el olamim, utzrov yitzrachayim en ishmotehem, Adonai hu nachalatam, v'yanucha v'shalom am shkevotehem, v'nomar Amen. Exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and the pure to the souls of our brethren who perished in Shoah, men, women, and children of the house of Israel who were slaughtered and suffocated and burned to ashes. May their memory endure and inspire deeds of charity and goodness in our lives. May their souls thus be bound up in the bond of life. May they rest in peace, and let us say, Amen.
Sprent briedelig, sprent. Oi, unser Arm stertelnebbig brennt. Beise Witten mit ihr Gosen reisen, brechen und zerblosen, starke noch die wilde Flammen, als herum Scheune brennt. Und ihr steht ohne Kota soi sich mit verlegte Händ. Und ihr steht ohne Kota soi sich unser Städtel brennt. Sprent briedelig, sprent. Oi, unser Arm steht unnebbig brennt. S haben schon in Feierzungen das ganze Städtelein geschlungen, und die Beise Witten huschen, unser Städtel brennt. Und ihr steht ohne Kota soi sich mit verlegte Händ. Und ihr steht und guckt, soi sich unser Städtel brennt. Sprent briedelig, sprent. Oi, es kann voll lille kommen der Moment. Unser Stadt mit uns zusammen soll auf Asche weg in Flammen, bleibt sohl wie auf noch a Schlacht, nur poste schwarze Welt. Und ihr steht und guckt, soi sich mit verlegte Hand. Und ihr steht und guckt, soi sich unser Städtel brennt. gewöhnt. Oib do steht Liesach Deier, nehmt die Kelim, löscht das Feier, löscht mit Eier eigene Blut, beweist, als ihr das könnt. Steht nicht Brüder und als soll sich mit verlegter Hand. Steht nicht Brüder, löscht das Feuer unser Städtel brennt.
My name is Arthur Spielman. I was born in 1928 in the city of Krakow. Iskada Shema Rabu Yomo de Beruchesa Yama Malchusai Machaya Foil Yama Foil of Chayat from Bajustua Bagulus Pankura Beim Leumain Yahai Shema Rabu Bavura Chulam Loma Yomayu Isbrak Ishtabak Ispua Visamam Visnasai Visadov Visale Visalo Shema de Kichu Barichi Leila min kol birchusu v'shilusu tishpachusu v'nechamusu v'amiram v'yomu v'imri yomar Yehai shlomo rabba min shemaya v'chaim olayni v'al kol yisruai v'imri yomar V'is Shalom Ibrahimo v'yas Shalom olayni v'al kol yisruai v'imri yomar.
Hello, my name is Stephen Radwin, and I am the president of the New Krakow Friendship Society. On behalf of this society, I would like to thank all of you for sharing with us this moving and memorable occasion. To Bernice, Cantor, Kanarek, Arthur, our speakers, Bonnie, Maria, Simone, and those families that lit candles, I say Yasher Koach. I would also like to acknowledge and thank all of those who worked so diligently behind the scenes, without whose help this event could not have come to fruition. Anna Schumann Gallegos, a 3G board member of the New Krakow Friendship Society, who is both the Zoom coordinator and director of this event. Aiden Gallegos, whose movie magic in creating the solemn candle lighting ceremony and merging Esperanto with the beautiful scroll of names of our society's family members who perished in the Holocaust. Stephen Morris, who is a social justice program associate for the Stephen Weiss Free Synagogue, who granted us permission to use Cantor Daniel Singer's soulful rendition of Esperanto. I hope that all who shared this event with us today will also share future events with us. As Bernice mentioned previously, we will close our program with the singing of the Partisan Lied, which became the anthem of all resistance fighters throughout Eastern Europe, followed by the singing of Hatikvah. Hopefully, for next year's commemoration, we will gather together in person. Cantor Kanarek, would you please do us the honor?
Sag nicht einmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg. Chosch Himmeln bleiene, verstellen bläue Tag. Kommen wird noch uns der ausgebänkte Show. Es wird abhäuten uns der Trott mit seinen Do. Kommen wird noch uns der ausgebänkte Show. Es wird abhäuten und der Trott mit seinen Do. Never say that there is is only death for you. Though leaden clouds may be concealing skies of blue, because the hour we have hungered for is near. Beneath our tread the earth shall tremble, we are here. Because the hour we have hungered for is near. Beneath our tread the earth shall tremble, we are here. Kol od balevav penima, nefesh Yehudi homiya, ulfaatei mizrach kadima, ayin lezion Sophia. Hatikvatenu, Hatikvah בת שנות 2000, להיות עם חופשי בארצנו, ארץ ציון וירושלים. להיות עם חופשי בארצנו, ארץ ציון וירושלים.